عملت لحلمي عملت كثيرا وها قد حصل سهرت تعبت وقد طاب ذا اليوم حلو السماء عملت لحلمي عملت كثيرا وها قد حصل سهرت تعبت وقد طاب.
Generally in Islamic jurisprudence, when it comes to lawmaking on is this halal or is it haram, this falls into the category of what is called fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. And things are usually classified into two. First category is called ibadat. Ibadat refers to acts of devotional worship, rituals like salat and fasting and hajj. In these areas of rituals, there's no creativity. You do things the way the Prophet did them, you pray the way the Prophet prayed. Those areas of rituals are prescribed. They have specific timing, they have specific ways of being done. You don't fast Ramadan anytime you want, you don't do your 5 daily prayers in any, no, you do them in the way the Prophet said, as acts of devotional worship called ibadat. So that is one category of activities. The second, which is the bigger category of activities in our daily lives, is mu'amalat. Mu'amalat refers to what some call them mu'amalat, some call them dunyawi. Dunyawi just means worldly, temporal, mundane, social transactions, interpersonal relations. So these have to do with how people do what they do in their everyday lives. Their administrative system, their healthcare system, their marital and interpersonal relations, their political systems, their security and defense systems, their educational systems, their food-related issues, issues surrounding cultural practices. So in all of these type of areas that are not ibadah, the other name that is used for ibadah, they call it deen. In other words, religion in the narrow sense of the term religion. So if it is not ibadah, then it belongs to mu'amalat. In the area of mu'amalat, there's a legal maxim, what you call like a default ruling of Sharia. In the jargon, they call it istishab. Istishab means legal presumption. It means the ruling that is the default ruling on things in that category. So for mu'amalat, from the point of view of the Maliki school of law, the Shafi school of law, the Hanafi school of law, the Hanbali school of law, so long as something belongs to the category of mu'amalat, social transactions, interpersonal activities, Independence Day celebration, wedding anniversaries, graduation ceremonies, New Year celebrations, anything that is clearly under mu'amalat, weekends, deciding which day is going to be a weekend, and you want to do it, why? Because it's convenient for all concerned. The moment it belongs to the category of mu'amalat, the default ruling in Sharia is that everything is halal except what is haram from evidence. So the default is, and in Arabic they will say al-asl fil ashya al-ibaha. That is the legal premise of things is permissibility. And whoever is wanting to make it a prohibition needs evidence for a prohibition. Whereas a lot of scholars will tell you in ibadah, in acts of worship or what they call deen affairs, prayer, fasting, etc., the rule is the other way around. Everything is haram except what is halal. There's some diversity of opinion on that one, but no need to go into that one. In the area of mu'amalat, where everything is halal except what is haram, the word bid'ah doesn't come up. Bid'ah only comes up if you are introducing something as a teaching of the religion when it is not a teaching of the religion. So if you say Islam recommends that we should have wedding anniversary, because you are saying Islam recommends, you are therefore saying Allah and the Prophet recommend. So we would like to see what is the evidence. If the answer is no, we do not have such a recommendation, then it is bid'ah to say it is Islamic. But you also do not say it is un-Islamic. It's just like crop rotation. Is that Islamic or not? I think in agriculture, it is an ada. It is a customary way of agriculture in some societies. When do you want to have 3 terms for educational systems in a year, or should we have 2 semesters, or should we have 4? Because it belongs to mu'amalat, everything is halal except what is haram. So it is halal by default. You have to bring evidence that it causes harm, either from the Quran or the Sunnah or ijma or reasoning by analogy, or certain harm that it causes against public interest, against the common good, before you can say it's haram. So if somebody wants to celebrate an Independence Day, the question is that Independence Day tied to ibadah, act of worship, or is it a social, cultural thing that a society wants to do? If it is a social, cultural thing they want to do, then go ahead and do it. It belongs to what they call mu'amalat, and under mu'amalat it is part of what is called urf wal-ada, local custom and tradition, that is not tied to religious worship. So when it comes to graduation ceremony, or matriculation, or housewarming, where in certain cultures, when you have a new house, you will have what they call a housewarming event, where you will invite people to come and, pray and enjoy and celebrate that you've got a new house. Some will do the same thing if the big reason for joy is they got a new job, or the wife wants to organize something because the husband was promoted in his job, or because he was given a national award, or he was given a traditional title and there was one ceremony in this thing. These are all in the category of mu'amalat that belong to worldly, cultural, social affairs. And the default position of Sharia is it is all halal, unless if you have evidence that something is haram. And then you pick the thing that is the thing. Is it there's a kind of dancing between men and women that is haram? Then you say the dancing is the haram part. You don't say the whole event is haram. It's just like wedding. Wedding is part of sunnah. But because somebody was extravagant, you don't say the whole thing is haram. You say the extravagance is haram. Whether it was done in a wedding, whether it was done in walima or Quranic recitation competition, the extravagance, you have to pick the haram and identify that as haram. So when it comes to the question of wedding anniversaries, when it comes to the issues of birthdays, in some cultures, it's not part of their culture. It's counterculture to have birthdays. In other cultures, birthday is nothing to do with Jesus. It's nothing to do with Maulud. It is an individual that we want to organize a program to commemorate the fact that they are 20 years old. And in some customs, they have what they call rites of passage. So certain customs, they will put, by the time you are 7 years old, we have to celebrate something. By the time you are 14, and in some cultures it's 18 years old, then we have to celebrate something. In some cultures, 21 years old. These are all cultural issues that Sharia leaves to the various shu'ub and waqaba'il. Allah created us into nations and tribes, lita'arafu, that we get to know one another. And that's where we get to know there are many cultural things in Islam that were done during the Jahiliyyah period. Islam didn't come and crush everything. No. How they did their agriculture, Islam left that one. How they did their farming and military fighting, in some cultural practices, it will be foreign cultural practices. So, say for example, the idea of digging a trench in the Battle of the Khandaq, or what is called the Ahzab, the Battle of the Trench. It was a Persian idea, military strategy, that Salman al-Faris told the Prophet, this is how we defend our cities in Persia. And the Prophet accepted it, even though it was foreign, it was not from Islamic sources, but because it served public interest, it was good, it was useful. The Prophet had no problem with foreign cultures or local cultures if they were good and they didn't contradict Quran and Sunnah. So you may say, but birthday is not our culture, but it is somebody else's culture. The Prophet didn't have a problem with people's foreign cultures. Yemeni culture, shaking hands was not originally an Arab culture. It was originally a Yemeni culture. But the Prophet had no problem adopting it as something that they all did. Certain things that were part of, when we talk about Muharram, Safar, Rabi al-Awwal, Rabi al-Thani, the various months, these were not months that were named by the Prophet. These were the pre-Islamic months that were already in place. And they all had different connotations. Some were considered sacred months in Jahiliyyah understanding. And why were they sacred? They were tied to their religion, and during those sacred months, the key thing was no fighting. No fighting. When Islam came, Islam continued to adopt the same names of the months. Ramadan was still Ramadan. Safar was still Safar. Rabi al-Awwal was still Rabi al-Awwal. But any pagan practices associated with those were not accepted. That these months were considered sacred months were still upheld, but not for their sacredness. So Ramadan is not one of the sacred months. But because the months, even in Jahiliyyah culture, meant no fighting in those months, because Islam came with a religion of peace, it recognized and upheld the no fighting policy. However, Quran says, if they fight you in the months, fight them back. So we are allowed. But the key point is, when something was tied to, or is tied to custom, that is tied to mundane activities, cultural festivals, agricultural festivals, educational graduation ceremonies, political appointment and awards, celebration at the end of an economic calendar of profits or losses, various compensations that are given at the end of year, bonuses. These are cultural things. It's not Sharia say you should do, but Sharia didn't even say you shouldn't do. So these are areas where everything is halal except what is clearly haram. So from the Sharia point of view, the moment somebody says, is this halal or haram? The first thing you ask is it ibadah, dealing with devotional worship, or is it mu'amalat, social transactions, cultural norms, urf and ada? If the answer is no, this is tied to worship and belief, it is tied to ibadah and aqidah, then they say this is area of deen. Before you do anything there, we need evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah, or the practice of the Prophet, or consensus of companions, or opinions of companions, or consensus of jurists, etc. In acts of ibadah, issues surrounding the narrow definition of deen. On issues surrounding mu'amalat, it's the opposite. Everything is halal except what is forbidden, and before you say haram to the freedom people have to choose, before you say haram, you must bring evidence from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from consensus of scholars, from Ra'i of Sahaba, or you can prove there is some harm that is caused.
عملت لحلمي عملت كثيرا وها قد حصل سهرت تعبت وقد طاب ذا اليوم
That is not correct, with all due respect. When the Prophet copied the Persians and their own strategy in mu'amalat. Persians were not Muslims. When the Prophet said in a hadith that because some recommended that he should prohibit what is called gila. A woman, so scholars even differ. Some say it's a woman who is lactating, breastfeeding, that she should not have sexual relations with her husband. Others say no. Gila means a woman that is pregnant should not have sexual relations with her husband. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, I was going to prohibit gila, but I noticed that it does not cause harm to the Romans and it doesn't cause harm to the Persians, so I am not going to prohibit it. Who was he referring to? The Romans were Orthodox Christians. The Persians were Zoroastrian. But the Prophet is saying, I noticed something in mu'amalah that didn't harm their own community, so why should we prohibit it in our own? In another hadith, he says he was going to prohibit coitus interruptus. Okay, other. But he noticed it didn't harm the Romans or the Persians. So he didn't prohibit it. So when it comes in usulul fiqh, in the principles of usulul fiqh, when you talk of sources of law, one of the sources of law is what is called urf. And sometimes they call it urf al-ada. And when it comes to urf al-ada, it is not urf al-ada of Muslims. It is local urf al-ada. So for example, is it halal for a Muslim to be called Adeola or to be called Bello or to be called Garba or to be called Ngozi? These are all names that didn't originate from Islam. But the truth of the matter is Umar did not originate from Islam. Muhammad did not originate from Islam. Salman, Bilal, Abu Bakr, Uthman, these are names that did not originate from Islam. The way the men were dressing at the time of the Prophet did not originate from Islam. Now our traditional Nupe dress or Hausa dress and Hausa hat and Yoruba dressing, and they are part of what Allah created in the diversity of humanity. And they are all halal by default. What you are not allowed to copy, the Prophet said, Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Whoever imitates the people is one of them. Whoever imitates the people. If you imitate hypocrites, you are one of them. If you imitate good people, you are one of them. If you imitate bad people, you are one of them. So when it comes to imitating non-Muslims, what is prohibited is very clear. You do not imitate them in their religious activities or those things that identify them as non-Muslims. In other words, they are religious symbols. So as a Muslim, you don't wear a crucifix. You don't dress in clothes that everybody sees your clothing. They say, this one is a Christian, or this one is a Jew because you wore a skull cap, or you wore a collar and you're a man, like a reverend father. Why? Because those are religious identity markers that identify your religion. There's an idea, a belief system behind that particular thing. But if you wear shirt and trouser, which religion are you copying? You're not copying anybody's religion. You're copying a cultural type of dressing. And different cultures have shirt and trouser. Whether it is Western culture, whether it is Persian culture, whether it is Indian culture, everybody with their own design of shirt and trouser or wrapper. So when it says, for example, do not dress like women, women should not dress like men. In other words, don't dress in a way where that type of dressing is identified as male dressing. And a man should not dress in a way that identifies him as a woman. But there's a kind of dressing in various cultures where men wear it and women wear it. For example, who wears wrappers? Okay, when you say wrapper, in culture, who wears wrappers? Depends on the culture. If you go to Igbo culture, some of their chiefs and leaders wear wrappers. If you go to Indonesia and Malaysia, they are Muslims, but they will wear wrappers. If you go to Yemen and Oman and the whole down Somalia, men wear wrappers. But in northern Nigeria, no man will wear a wrapper. But in the hadith, we have that the Prophet wore izar. Izar is wrapper. Izar is wrapper. Why? Because in his culture, men can wear wrappers, women can wear wrappers. What today we call unisex type of dressing. So when it comes to we shouldn't imitate the kuffar, or we shouldn't imitate non-Muslims, we are only prohibited from imitating non-Muslims in their non-Muslimness, in those things that identify them as non-Muslim. But you don't say you can't imitate them in their language because it's non-Muslim language. When was Arab Muslim language? Arab started as Jahiliyyah. But Allah describes all languages as part of His own ayah and creation. You know, all our colors, all our cultures and customs, everything is halal except what is haram. And what we come to do is identify what is haram, and that one we don't follow, or we change it. You know, when Allah says, the Prophet said, whoever sees something wrong, change it. The Prophet had people doing polygamy. Islam did not introduce polygamy, but it was changed and modified to something that was Islamically acceptable. Islam didn't introduce divorce. Divorce was already taking place. Different types of divorce. Just as different types of marriages. Islam modified what was wrong, change it to be correct. And in the one that is correct, you adopt. The one that you need to change, you change. Things like jizya, zimma. There are so many things in the religion. Islam didn't introduce them. Islam found them being practiced, but in some ways they were unjust. So it modified them to suit the justice that Islam stood for. So when somebody says, you don't imitate people, the Prophet had no problem dressing like an Arab. Why? He wasn't copying Jahiliyyah and their religion. He was copying their cultural dress. He was given Yemeni dressing. Sometimes he was given, Persian dressing. And he wore it. Why? Because it wasn't religious. It was cultural. The Prophet had no problem with people of different cultures keeping their own culture. When a person from the UK or America or Finland embraces Islam, which culture should he dress in? He will dress according to his own culture. But all you then tell him is, don't dress according to your religious, leaders of another religion. No. And that is why when you say, what is Muslim hijab like? It depends on the culture. The Malaysian one is accepted by scholars as Islamic. The Indonesian one, the Pakistani one, the Iranian one, the Saudi one, the Moroccan one, the Jordanian one, the Syrian one, the one we have of the Yoruba dressing, and everybody with their own style, their own design. Why? Because the Quran and Sunnah did not prescribe any design. It didn't prescribe any color. Any scholar that is telling you a man's dressing or a woman's dressing should be this color, just ask him, which hadith are you quoting? None. Which ayah of the Quran? None. You don't impose your own cultural preference and you say that's what the whole world should go with. So you can just say, in my own culture, this is what our scholars say is more appropriate. So regarding the issue of copying non-Muslims, the Prophet and Sahaba had no problem copying non-Muslim medications. The Prophet, some of the doctors, the physicians that the Prophet recommended to see Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, a companion, the guy was a Jew. There was a Christian who used to live in Mecca and used to stay near Marwa. And, they met the caliph, they offered medication. No one said this is Jewish medicine. Why? It wasn't religious. These were the traditional herbal medicines that people used that were effective. So when it comes to mu'amalat, weaponry, Muslims didn't invent swords and bows and arrows and whatever. In fact, mangonels, these big catapults that are used in war, it was Salman al-Faris that introduced it to the Prophet ﷺ as part of what they used in Persia. It wasn't introduced or invented by Muslims. And that is why in the area of engineering, in the area of architecture, in the area of medicine, in the area of literacy, language, art, engineering, mechanics, defense, security, agriculture, this issue of cross-pollination, it does cultural practices, and the Prophet endorsed and accepted it. So anybody saying you cannot copy the culture of non-Muslims have to qualify it. You cannot copy the culture of non-Muslims that conflicts with the Quran and Sunnah or Islam. But if it doesn't conflict, then any form of dressing, food, cultural activities of non-Muslims is halal by default, except where there's evidence that that particular culture or aspect of the culture is haram.